Welcome back everyone to A History of Horror. In the 1980s, Hollywood reached its apex for conventional special effects and art design. It was a time when creativity and mechanics were best used to both amaze and disgust audiences. Sadly, it would be a lost art by the 1990s, as studios would start opting to save money with CGI effects. I could make a series of videos on 80s horror alone, but that's already been done many times, and quite effectively. And to start off this decade, we'll kick it off with Friday the 13th, directed by Sean Cunningham. As you may have remembered from a few weeks ago, John Carpenter's Halloween was cheap to make and it made a shit ton of money at the box office. So it was only a matter of time before the slasher subgenre went into overdrive and filmmakers tried replicating it. They're fun and relatively simple to produce. Just get a camera, a weapon, and some friends together, and you too can make a slasher movie. After finishing Last House on the Left with Wes Craven, Cunningham's career didn't go as well as he had hoped. He made a living as a softcore porn director through the 70s before deciding that he wanted to get away from that kind of work. Without even having a script, he created the title Friday the 13th and began an ad campaign. His goal was to make sure he wouldn't get sued for the title, but he ended up getting several calls from distributors asking when the film would be ready for release. I don't think this is the way you're supposed to do things in the movie business, but it somehow worked in his favor. The story is pretty simple, taking place at a summer camp called Camp Crystal Lake. Two teenage counselors are getting hot and heavy before they're cock-blocked and killed off by an unseen assailant.
We weren't doing anything, we were just messing up.
The camp closes and reopens several times over the years, each time closing due to something bad happening, earning it the title Camp Blood. Time passes, and eventually this sketchy guy decides to reopen the camp himself. As he and the counselor Alice are getting the camp ready on Friday the 13th, the rest of the counselors arrive, and they all begin their shenanigans while a deranged killer stalks teenagers in the woods. I wish I could say there was more to the story than this, but there's really not. Unfortunately, much of the runtime consists of scenes where nothing interesting happens. Most directors would have cut away in scenes like this, but Cunningham decided that he had to wait until this asshole was completely out of frame. There's another scene where we watch Alice making coffee, and we have to just sit there and watch the entire process. Friday the 13th is slowed through most of the runtime, but the murders are awesome, and they're done by the legendary special effects artist Tom Savini. The degree of creativity and gore set the stage for all the bloody movies we'd see later in the decade. The film's score is similar to Psycho, but what makes it stand out is the famous shh that's heard whenever the killer is near. It's especially effective with the use of voyeuristic POV shots, which were undoubtedly taken from the playbook for Halloween. Seriously, if you're a fan of POV shots, this is definitely the movie for you. They are everywhere. As Alice desperately tries to keep herself from getting murdered, a new gentle face arrives at the camp. However, it turns out the sweet woman is actually the killer, and she spent the past 2 decades avenging the death of her son Jason, who had drowned in the lake all those years ago. The trauma of losing her kid made her go insane, and ever since she's been killing the kinds of teenagers who should have been watching Jason instead of giving handjobs in the woods. I love the way she talks about Jason here, and her rapid transition into madness.
Jason should have been watched every minute. He wasn't a very good swimmer.
It's like she knows she's insane, and she doesn't even care. Mainstream critics hated the movie, but its target audience loved it, and that's all that mattered. For Friday the 13th though, the original movie isn't even that important. What makes it stand out is that it kickstarted a franchise and gave us one of the biggest figures in modern horror. As you already know, Jason Voorhees is the killer in all of the sequels. He's a pop culture icon. I'll bet when someone wears a goalie mask, people associate it more to Jason than to hockey. When I was a kid, my brother owned the shitty Nintendo game, and that's where I learned about him. I'm sure a lot of other people learned about Jason long before seeing the movies. Cunningham never intended for there to be a sequel, and when the series became more about Jason, he left the franchise entirely. I don't have time to do a video on each installment, but just for funsies, I'll give a brief recap on the entire series right now. In part 2, the movie feels the same as the original, but this time with Jason taking place as the star. It's a basic summer exploit film with all the stupid cliches. Jason doesn't have his hockey mask yet, but everything will come in gradually. Part 3 was the 3D edition, and it's awesome. In this one, Jason finally gets the mask and gets in a few sweet kills. The series was supposed to end here, but it was so successful that they had to keep going. Part 4 was planned to be the final chapter, and it clearly wasn't. I actually recommend this one if you haven't seen any of the others. Savini is back doing the gore, and Crispin Glover shows off his awesome dance skills. Part 5 is a weird sequel taking place at a mental institution, and everyone in the movie is crazy as hell. I don't want to spoil the ending, but it's either the weakest or the strongest sequel of the series, depending on who you talk to. In Part 6, Jason comes back from the grave, giving us his famous intro, and takes time to parody James Bond. He becomes supernatural and powerful in this one, which is interesting, but the rest of the movie is pretty dull. Part 7 is the best one in my opinion. Jason was supposed to fight Freddy Krueger, but negotiations fell through, so they made him fight a telekinetic girl instead, pretty much creating an unofficial Jason vs. Carrie. It's also the first time Jason is played by the legendary Kane Hodder, and his costume looks fantastic. In Part 8, Jason goes to Manhattan, which is a cool idea, but with their low budget, the movie is pretty bad. A couple of scenes are cool, but everything else sucks. Part 9, Jason Goes to Hell. The series was burned out by this point, and this movie is the weirdest of the bunch. With that final scene though, holy shit. In Part 10, there was nothing left for Jason to do, so the studio said, fuck it, let's take him to space. Jason Goes to Hell teased us with the Freddy Krueger crossover, but we'd have to wait 10 years for Freddy vs. Jason to finally come out. I loved it when I was a teenager, seeing it in the theater multiple times. It had a great soundtrack, and it's cool to see your favorite characters in the same movie. Kinda like the monster mashups from the 40s and 50s. A reboot came out in 2009, but it brought nothing new. Tits and blood, and that's about it. Rather than marathoning the whole series, you can get the basic idea by watching tidbits of each of the movies. If you're new to the franchise and would like to get a good feel for it, I would sit through Part 4 and Part 7. Those are the best in my opinion, and they recap the whole series so you don't have to. Jason has a tragic background, and he displays the sadness of an outcast, sorta like Frankenstein's monster. So instead of being afraid, you end up rooting for him as he kills his next victim. You don't watch these movies for substance, you watch them for the sex and violence, and the cathartic feeling of watching people get butchered in creative ways. And with 12 movies, over 100 kills, and a primetime spot on the AHoH show for some reason, Jason has rightfully earned his place as one of the most iconic characters in horror history.